All right. I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today we have a special guest, James Rankin, who I'll do a formal introduction here in a minute. But James is going to be talking about how you can best adapt Citrix troubleshooting workflows, especially with the remote workforce that is present here across the globe today. Before we jump in and have James get into his content, I did want to do a quick housekeeping. So in terms of flow today, James is going to walk through scenarios that he is seeing and some tips and tricks that he uses in order to really adapt how he troubleshoots and monitors end-user experience now that everyone's working remotely. If you have questions, please submit them. We are going to hold them till the end so that we can go ahead and make sure we have enough time to get through today's content. And one question that always comes up, will I get the recording? Yes, within the next 24 hours, you will have the recording in your inbox so that you can listen to anything that James has shared with you, share it potentially with colleagues as well. And now, before I introduce James, I did just want to take one slide to introduce Goliath. I see from the names, we have a few of you that have joined in past webinars and might be familiar with us, but we do have some new names joining as well. So here at Goliath, we provide monitoring and troubleshooting software really to anticipate, troubleshoot, and document end-user experience issues across your virtualized environment, whether that is Citrix, which we're focused on today, or VMware Horizon. When you look at the logos on the screen, this just represents some of the customers that we support today. And one thing each of those clients will tell you is that why they've invested in Goliath is because of our embedded automation and intelligence and the ability to automatically discover the entire IT infrastructure, identify all IT elements, conditions, and thresholds that may impact end-user experience, and then it will allow you to really go ahead and add almost 2 to 3 full-time troubleshooting experts into your environment. And so by using the software, it is by almost augmenting your entire staff because of that intelligence that's embedded in. The other takeaway from this slide is you can see that we have a focus in healthcare, and I see that we've got some healthcare clients on the line today. We have purpose-built modules that will look not only across the IT infrastructure, end-user behavior, but also into all major EHR modules, being Cerner, Epic, Metascript, and Allscripts as well. So with that, I am going to turn it over to James. He's really going to jump into the material today. And as he takes control of the slides, let me do a formal introduction for those that might not know James. James is a consultant and blogger who is focused mainly on the EUC technology, security, mobility, and digital transformation. With 25 years of experience in the field, he's based in the UK, and he works mostly with financial services and educational sector clients. He's a frequent blogger, YouTuber, and presenter around EUC and Windows Tech. So we're honored to have James here with us today. James, thank you for joining, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. If you could make me presenter, and I can now show my screen. Let me see if I can get the right screen this time. Hopefully you should be seeing when he switches to slide view from here. Can you say that okay?
Seeing it now.
Excellent. Right. There you go. Right. Thank you for that introduction there. I will continue with a quick bit of flagrant self-promotion here. As already said, I work within a number of industry verticals. I write articles, I record videos. So if you want, you can go over and search YouTube for James Rankin, and you'll probably get a couple of hits. One of them is a pilot guy who does really exciting videos of planes. I am the not very exciting one who does the technical videos instead. So come along and subscribe to my YouTube channel, because I only need another couple of 100 subscribers before I get monetized, even though I doubt very much I'm going to be able to retire from that. But that's my current life goal at the moment. I also have a website, james-rankin.com, where I post up most of my articles. I'm doing a series at the minute about all sorts of optimizations for logons and things like that. I also have obviously a Twitter handle as well. I am James 4 underscores ranking on Twitter. I don't know why I picked that particular odd handle, but if I do any work outside of my own blog where I write for other publications and things like that, obviously I post all the links up on Twitter. So just a quick shout out as well. I spoke to a lot of guys I knew in the industry about the subject matter that we're talking about today. So I've fed in a few of other people's experiences as well. So thanks to all those guys, both in the CTP program and also some of the users out on the World of EUC Slack channel as well, who helped me with some pointers. And what we're going to talk about today is how we've had to adapt, right, to the COVID-19 pandemic. Unless you've been living under a rock, you can't but help have noticed the fact that the world has been under various stages of lockdown. I've just been told myself today that we're going to have a 10 p.m. curfew on the pubs where I live around here, which is not going to go down very well. But this has greatly impacted how we support users, how we onboard users, and how we actually provide a working environment to those users. So hopefully going to tell you some of the stories around that. So my COVID-19 experience kind of was focused pretty much on with one particular customer really, and the estate that they had before COVID-19 was what you might describe as very, very, very traditional. I shall just quickly move this out the way so I can see my notes properly. There you go. So we've got here a quick diagram on the right hand side. You can see where we've got, you know, big corporate offices with lots of users and laptops and desktops in there, all connected via good, solid, dedicated network links to the data centers that hold their corporate resources, right? Their email, their AD, their data, their SharePoint sites, their applications, all that sort of stuff. Now, what they did have a remote working solution, yeah? This remote working solution was not a very good one because I had to use it myself. It basically involved users with laptops, whether they be at home or in the airport, wherever, connecting up via a Cisco VPN, the quality of which was not great at all, to be perfectly honest. They also had, down at the bottom here as well, a number of what we call GSPs, which are global service providers. So large numbers of outsourced offshore users. These users, again, sat in dedicated offices for these global service providers. They're connected via dedicated MPLS baseline links, and they generally were given for security purposes a Citrix desktop, a full Citrix desktop. However, this Citrix desktop environment wasn't available externally because of security reasons again. So what they had here, the VPN that they had in place, basically when they started thinking about maybe everybody's going to have to work from home because of coronavirus, they already knew that that VPN couldn't handle that many users in its current form. And even for those users that could use the VPN solution, the problem was, I said already, the quality wasn't great and it would only get worse the more users that were put onto it. The users out for the GSPs were an even bigger problem because they had, if they were all to have got sent home, and we weren't sure about it at that point, basically we had no way of provisioning them any kind of external access whatsoever. They would have needed to have been provided with proper corporate laptops, which with the VPN client on them, the procurement time and lead time ahead of that was way, way off, probably at least 2 or 3 weeks to get it out to that many users. So you can safely say that the first lesson that we've got to learn from COVID-19 is that to fail to prepare is to prepare to fail. They were totally caught on the hop by this. They were woefully underprepared. And I'm sure there's many, many enterprises that found themselves in the same boat. So what we had was, all of a sudden, when it looked like we were going to get locked down, straight away the business started thinking, oh my God, what can we do to get everyone working remotely? What are the requirements that we've got around this? Firstly, because kind of international sort of restrictions around coronavirus could change very quickly. I mean, if you're in the UK, right, Scotland, England and Wales all have different levels of restrictions, right? And they even have localized lockdowns now. So with this rapidly changing environment, what we needed to be able to do was to scale up very quickly and also potentially scale down at the fastest possible pace. Now, naturally, the business also wanted every single application to be available and functional and working absolutely perfectly. They also had the usual kind of requirement that the performance needed to be as good or better than what was currently being used. And of course, the security on this needed to be absolutely watertight, possibly even more watertight, because we're now talking about unmanaged devices being involved as well. And naturally as well, they wanted the support for that to be very easy to access and very thorough and fully prepared to support all the new needs of our users. As usual, the business requirements are very, very steep. Now, fortunately for this particular business that I was working with, where their current way of remote working couldn't support all of their users, there was something that was in the background that had the potential to give them a kind of a get out of jail free card. Now, it was a small project that I'd actually been working on, and the purpose of this project had been, over the sort of year and a half or so prior to COVID, was to provide access to virtual desktops for about 300 to 500 developers who were based offshore. Now, it was running on Citrix Cloud in Amazon Web Services, which was a bit of an unusual config. But the even more fortunate bit was that I'd kind of been left alone to tinker with it for about 8 months or so. So what I'd done was I was considering at the start of 2019 going on a bit of a personal crusade to get more people working from home, because I've worked from home for a very long time and I know the benefits of it. So I was always thinking more people should. So the idea was I had this solution that I'd kind of been left alone to tinker with, and I wanted to make it as performant as possible compared to a standard desktop, and to try and convince more people to work from home. So on this side of things, I'd been looking at the security aspect. I'd also been looking at the rapid deployment aspect. So it was really, really convenient for them that kind of when COVID came along, I had this ready. There's a quick diagram here of how it was set up to work. We've got the users on the left-hand side there, connecting via public internet from their clients, right? So their clients, even unmanaged devices, coming in via the public internet, hitting the Citrix Gateway service. At that point, authentication done with Azure AD and Azure MFA, which was also linked into the customer AD. So we already ticked the boxes for MFA and things like that. And then we had, within the AWS cloud, we had 2 sets of different desktops because we had to abide by proper network segregation rules. So we had some non-production environments, one-to-one VDIs for the developers to use, but also, and this was the important bit, we had a separate environment that was a hosted shared desktop that allowed them to use Office apps like Skype and email and things like that. And these were kept separate. And when COVID came along, I thought, wow, maybe that hosted shared desktop could be the way forward for all these users that we've got sent home. We had full connectivity to Office 365 via Express route from that, internet connectivity as well, but also as an added bonus, we had a route into some hosted and on-premises Citrix environments so that the applications we had hosted internally could also be presented to the users coming in through here. So if we needed to have like a double hop scenario, we had the potential to do that as well. So we had a lot of boxes ticked. We had anywhere access, we had the MFA, we had the Office 365, we had the network segregation, we had the access to the on-premises environments, and we also had, this was something I'd worked really closely with the cloud operations teams with, we had the potential to do rapid scaling and rapid application updating, which I'll talk more about in the next slide. So kind of this business was at the COVID time, you know, and they were starting to think, are we going to have to send everybody home? And I was kind of sat at the back with my hand in the air going, you know, you can all stop panicking. Maybe we've got something here that can meet your needs. Now, the interesting thing was when I suggested this as a solution, the first thing they wanted to know was how could it meet the needs to scale up that rapidly. Now, this is a bit of a crap slide, actually, if I'm brutally honest. I was not happy with it, but just from left to right, from top to bottom, it runs through the process that we use to get these machines built. Now, we didn't actually, this was a bit of a first for me in a Citrix environment, we didn't use MCS, mainly because our security team wouldn't let us use MCS, which sounds really weird. But also, as we found as we went along, MCS didn't give us real control over where we could place the workers as we provisioned them inside of AWS. And I had to come up with a provisioning method that kind of matched up with all of these sort of cloud first sort of processes that our cloud team had to abide by. And we went with a provisioning method that used things like Packer, Terraform, Puppet, and Chocolatey. Now, we worked on the principle that one of the biggest blockers to rapid deployment, and hence one of the biggest things we needed to get out of the way to make this a kind of like a COVID-ready solution is the fact that endpoints need to be patched with operating system hotfixes and application updates and all sorts of things when you provision them. So usually this depends on the worker being provisioned, booted up, it contacts a WSUS or SCCM server, it downloads and installs updates, then it maybe contacts SCCM, installs application updates, reboots multiple times, and it can be very time consuming, particularly if it's got to download lots of cumulative updates, which, as everybody knows, are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The beauty of this is what we did was actually use the Amazon golden AMI, the golden Amazon machine image. Azure has its own sort of equivalent of that as well. And it basically comes pre-populated with all your Windows operating system patches, right? Now, there is a principle called joint responsibility that applies here, right? So you can't, for instance, get breached and then decide that you're going to sue Amazon for not putting a patch on, right? You have a responsibility to make sure that the AMI is patched to your standards. But that just means for the second phase here, what we do is we run a compliance scan to ensure that all the patches are on there. I can't remember what we used, Tanium or something like that. So after that, right, we then sysprep this AMI and use Packer, use infrastructure as code and Jenkins pipelines and all sorts of stuff that I don't really fully understand because my cloud ops teams are such clever guys. It then creates all these and produces them in the staging area through all this infrastructure of code, infrastructure as code, creates the required number of instances, and it deploys them with a base operating system with all those patches in there, along with little bits of tool sets like Chocolatey, which is in there. Now, Chocolatey is also a great way of getting installations done because it uses a principle called evergreen installs, right? You install via Chocolatey with the ensure parameter set to latest. Instead of having to maintain your own repositories and update them with the latest patch versions and things like that, right? Chocolatey just goes out to the Chocolatey online repositories and grabs the latest version of all the core applications that you're putting on there, which again is absolutely excellent. It then goes through a restart procedure, shutdown script, which is put on there, joins it to the domain, and then when it comes back up again, it basically runs a PowerShell startup script that's provided to it via group policy. And this is where it gets really clever again, because this PowerShell script does all sorts of things. It sets up the whole user environment, does a lot of configuration, and starts the AppV Entix agent that brings down all the other applications. But all of this is done completely on the fly. There are no sort of external dependencies. So you don't have to remember, for instance, the FSLogix rule sets, you don't have to have them being copied down from a file share. So you would get a problem if the file share was unavailable. It creates all these files on the worker on the fly. And another thing this script does, as I said, it starts the AppV Entix agent, which used to be called the AppV scheduler, which is a way of deploying AppV packages without any of the supporting infrastructure, no streaming servers, no publishing servers. We have one external dependency here. It's a file share that it pulls down all of the non-core apps from, synchronizes them from a file share. Mainly these are kind of like internal bespoke applications or old legacy ones, you know, outside of the core app. And then the FSLogix agent fires up as well, uses those dynamically created FSLogix rules to then put the application controls on top of that, right? So if you've got sensitive applications, like this being finance, a lot of them are, the application controls are then provided by the FSLogix rules over the top. And once this is done, when it's finalized, we do a second stage full compliance scan on there, which checks for any vulnerabilities. It checks that the patch levels are done. It checks that all the security tools are on there and configured correctly. And if it doesn't score over 90%, that machine is instantly binned, it's gone, it's thrown away. However, if it does score over 90% in this compliance scan, I think our current level is about 92, it is then released, it is automatically joined to the catalogs, joined to the delivery groups, and fired up and placed and available for logon. So that is the way we managed to get around being able to rapidly scale these machines. I think at the height of our COVID deployment, the maximum speed we achieved was 1,080 workers per hour was the speed that we deployed at, which was absolutely incredible. So the benefits we get from the rapid scale here, and this is why I think if you're gonna, you know, adapt yourself to the kind of coronavirus pandemic and also make sure that you don't get caught on the hop by anything like this again, make sure you adopt this kind of DevOpsy style method. No patching is required, right? Generally, all of the patches are in there. Obviously, you do a scan. Each of these set of workers is fully rebuilt every 30 days. They are torn down, right? You know, if there's an advanced persistent threat on there, for instance, that doesn't get detected for some reason, its maximum lifetime is limited to that. Those non-core applications, because we're using the AppV schedule, we can update them on the fly simply by updating those copies in the central file share, and then they get cached down at the next pull. This entire environment runs from a single image because each user gets their application sets controlled by app masking with FS logics. That whole user environment, as I said, no external dependencies. It runs a PowerShell script, which is huge, to be honest, as PowerShell scripts go, but it works a treat. And it's almost getting to the stage of like a desired state config, really, because if we find a worker that, for instance, hasn't been configured correctly, we can just run the script again, see if it rectifies it. If it doesn't, we just take it out of service and throw it away. But the margin for error in these builds is significantly reduced because it's quite highly automated. Now, you can still screw up, basically. Somebody once accidentally fat-fingered the wrong set of service. They pointed the pipeline at the wrong service. So there is the potential for human error, but it's significantly reduced. And we've also extended this to infrastructure components, this same sort of principle. So our cloud connectors, our RDSH servers, our RDSH license servers, our file servers, are all done that same way. If you were an on-premises deployment, you'd probably do the same thing with DDCs, storefront, etc., and things like that. What it's important to do, though, is when you move to this DevOpsy style model, is to remember that you're always going to be in a state of flux, right? We are constantly rebuilding this environment. Soon as the AMI comes out every month, we put it into dev. This is a bit of a, unfortunately, a bit detailed showing of it, but all the work's done in dev. We test the new changes, new requests, any defects in there, we try and fix them within that first week in the dev environment. Once it passes that, it then rolls into the UAT environment where it gets some kind of real users on there, proper application owners. Again, if anything fails, we push it back through, provide the fixes, update the build. If then it passes again, we push to pre-prod, which is a much more formalized testing phase. It's a direct replica of production apart from these new changes. And if it passes through there as well, it's by the end of the month, usually it's added to that production build pipeline. All the old servers are torn down, replaced with new ones. The users don't really notice this, as I say, because we've got FS logics in there, we've got the likes of AppV, we've got a script that builds all that user environment for them. And when the servers are rolled out new, you very rarely would even know that you'd actually gone to a new server. In fact, the only way you would be able to tell, I think generally, is if you actually could see what the host name was of the server. So I think the kind of second point that I wanted to make is to adapt to COVID, you need to take this DevOpsy style approach. As I said, with our on-premises environment, we were quoted, we said it would take, we were told it would take at least a week to deploy 1,000 new workers in there, probably more if they had to wait for hardware. These methods, you just get the credit card out and you can have it done in under an hour. So we had the sort of situation where users in India were all of a sudden told they had to go home. We had something like 6,000 users that need to be online as soon as possible. We could do that, put the capacity in there for them within an hour. And one thing I'd love to call out about this is the fact this is the first Citrix deployment I've ever done where the servers don't have a reboot schedule. They are never rebooted. Users can reboot their one-to-one VDIs if they want by using the restart function, but the actual RDSH workers themselves are never ever rebooted unless there is an actual fault with them. They don't need to be rebooted. They last for 29-30 days and then they're torn down again, and I'm still very proud of that particular detail. Now obviously what you need to do as well is, once you've got this rapidly scaling platform, is make sure you've got all your apps on there. And it's very difficult. Often users don't understand what it is they're using or things that they need to use. So this is where we start talking about proactive monitoring being king. Here's a kind of a diagram here of everything I'd like to know in an ideal situation about every application in my estate. You're not ever going to know this, but it's very important, particularly the bits in the scope bit at the top there in pink. You know, where are they installed? What will they run on? Do they need any prerequisites? How many people use them? How often do they use them? How important is that application to them? So these are things, not you know, there are some things that you can't get from monitoring, but you can get a good understanding of these sorts of things by using good monitoring. So you need to cross-reference these things with, you know, documented records and vendor best practices. An example we had here, we got told there was an app we needed to onboard, which was Bloomberg. And you know, when you look at Bloomberg, it doesn't look that bad. It looks like it's just got a funny license. Then when you start understanding the actual resource requirements of things like Bloomberg, you really need to go back and revisit what you're trying to do. Another thing that jumped out when we started crunching the data about applications, in the original deployment of this environment, pre-COVID, we had PowerShell blocked for security purposes, but looking on the actual, the desktop estate to see what users were using, looking at the monitoring tools there, we saw lots of instances of PowerShell being run. And when we dug into that, we found that a lot of users needed to use PowerShell for crunching data and some operational capabilities. So we had to make leeway for that. The other thing is, once you understand as much as you can about your applications, you always need to be able to quickly deploy them. That goes without saying, but you also need to be in the process of preparing and testing the next iteration of the build, because users will sometimes come along, they have seasonal apps, they might use them once a quarter or once a month or something like that. So you get things deployed and then a subset of users will turn around and say, actually, we need access to this and we don't have it. So you've got to be in a situation where you can get that data down there, find out what you need, get it deployed and get it done as quickly as possible. Now, obviously, it's ideal if you already have monitoring on your existing estates to get that data when you need to switch it over. But if you don't have it, then, if you've got to retrofit it, then get it done as soon as possible. Applications is the first area where good monitoring will make all the difference to you. As I said, it is absolutely crucial to be monitoring things, auditing them, setting baselines so that every time you make a change in your environment, that you understand any impact onto there. So, if you've got users who are logging on in X amount of time, you put a security change in, that log on increases. You don't want to impact that user experience because it's very, very important with everybody working remotely. Making sure all of this is in place, the monitoring is absolutely crucial. Now, once you've actually got the infrastructure prepared so you can scale it up rapidly and you've got all your applications in there, the next challenge, and this was one of the biggest challenges that we found, is actually getting those users on board. Now, especially if you've got a globally diverse user base like we had, it is a really big challenge. So the first thing we did was set up a dedicated team that were equipped specifically to deal with the user onboarding. And we made sure the contact details for this team were communicated to people via email and via intranet pages and things like that, and updates on Yammer and other weird things that we use. We put it onto workspace pages as well, and also onto the actual published desktop background as well. So we overloaded the users with, sort of information saying this is who you need to contact, this is how you need to contact them if you have a problem getting onboarded. Now, remote working, unfortunately, for a lot of people who are not used to it, is something of a cultural barrier, right? And one thing we quickly realized when doing this kind of uplift, we realized that things like user guide PDFs and frequently asked question documents and other very dry sort of literature, even when they're easily accessible to the users, they weren't really read by the majority of the users. And what we found were users were much more responsive to quick, to the point, punchy video guides, right? I mean, I've fallen in this trap a few times on my YouTube channel. I spend a long time waxing lyrical about something, trying to cover everything and being really in depth. And people don't want to hear that. They want you to get them into the right place as quickly as possible so that they can get on with doing their job. Now, most user interface tools are fairly intuitive anyway, right? So you just need to get the users into that situation to get them pointed in the right direction. And you'd be surprised how it's not that difficult to produce, decent looking videos if you've got users, admins who are au fait with something like Camtasia or Adobe After Effects. Actually, Adobe After Effects is horrible. Sorry, Camtasia, probably a better example. But you can get them to start making how-to videos straight away. There's an example here. This is me showing users how to use MFA to get logged on to the environment that we'd set up. And we got a great response to this, and it really accelerated the onboarding process. So as I said, we showed users how to sign up for the MFA, how to use the MFA, because that was a big sort of sea change for them. They weren't used to having to use MFA. And also just things like checking that their USB devices, like their headsets, are properly connected to their clients and also being detected by the operating system as well. And these two areas cut down on a lot of common help desk calls. And again, this is where looking at the data comes in, because things like you've got to see what sort of problems are you getting coming in? What sort of problems are your users having within there? And then formulating your response around that to produce the right kind of collateral. We also found that the dedicated response team had to be much more comfortable with kind of thinking outside the box when it comes to user issues, because previously they were always looking for problems with our infrastructure, right, with corporate infrastructure. But now the users have got problems that are more to do with local things, their local setup, their internet service provider, things like that. People have got kids at home that have been sent home from school and they're sharing a connection with other adults in the same house that are logging on to other companies. They're all contending on the same broadband. They're all logging on at the same time of the morning. The kids are running Zoom meetings because they're supposed to be getting schooled, or they're playing Fortnite instead, and everything's under pressure. So we found the role of the first responders became rather to find quick workable solutions, mainly to connectivity challenges, right? Dealing with Wi-Fi interference, helping users run wired connections to get better response, maybe switching them to tethering. All these sort of ways of working, the support team needed to adapt to. And we saw a lot early on, especially with our users in India who'd been sent home, their connectivity was terrible. We had some that had something like 18,000 milliseconds latency and higher coming in. And the support teams were trying to help these people with issues, and they weren't getting to the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem was, if they'd looked in the right places, if they'd looked at the data coming from the monitoring tool, they would have seen how horrendous the latency was. And they could have said, look, I can't help you till you actually do something about the terrible connectivity you've got. Eventually, the companies, the JSPs, provided them with better internet connectivity through dongles and things like that to make up for the problems. But getting to the heart of that involved turning it around a bit, how we dealt with the user queries coming in. Now, another great help that we found was actually to publish tools within the user session and give them access to dashboards and let them see that data and status to identify if there's any issues you can help with. So we published things like the HDX monitor within the session to tell them what their available bandwidth was, and got them to check this against speed testing tools on their client to see if they had a problem. If there was a problem, we had dashboards published. We published access to the Citrix Cloud status page as well. We had things like BG Info in the session, all of them to help the user try and help themselves. And this is really a bit of a sea change, really, a real sea change. Because I remember back when AppSense, for instance, they had a self-service profile reset tool, and nobody ever turned it on, right? Because they were terrified that the users were going to break things. But now, all of a sudden, with the pressure being piled on with all these remote workers, all of a sudden self-help is really back in vogue. So we've got things like password resets in there, but we'd love to have things like how a user can reset their own session. We let our VDI users obviously reboot their own machines, but the more self-help we could provide and back these up with instructional videos really helped our users out and took the pressure off our support teams. So again, another big sea change we saw was all of a sudden self-help tools and dashboards and letting the users access data and try and sort of identify if there's a problem that they need to be aware of is very important to helping them, be able to continue working and diagnose any faults that are out there, and if there are, how long it's going to take them to get resolved. Another thing to talk about when it comes to user onboarding is once you open up to users with unmanaged devices, what do you do? I mean, can you have users who are using an unpatched Windows XP laptop with an ancient Citrix receiver and no antivirus on? Can you let these people on? We had to set some standards, really, especially in the early days. I mean, if you're managing your own NetScalers, then you've got endpoint analysis and things like that can help out greatly here. But as we were in cloud and using the gateway service, we didn't have that kind of option. Not yet, anyway, which is about as much as I can say about that. But in order to try and meet standards when you haven't got the ability to enforce them, again, this is where monitoring comes to the fore, right? We constantly needed to make sure we're always understanding what the user, what OS the user's using, what client they're coming from, what their network connectivity is, right? And compare that configuration to our baseline standard. So we had to teach the support teams to be really stringent with people and use that data to say to people, look, you don't meet the minimum levels for this to access this service, so please go away and get it upgraded, get it made better. We also have the problem with things like MacBooks coming along, and our support teams weren't really experienced with MacBooks, so we had to be very stringent with those in insisting on particular OS level versions and particular Citrix Workspace app versions. There's also another thing that we found data very useful for was we had lots of users who would connect up using the HTML5 receiver rather than the full fat receiver. And basically, we found that the service didn't perform as well with HTML5. So we've constantly been running reports against the data we had to find all the users connecting with the HTML5 receiver, to contact them, give them the instructional video that tells them how to switch back to the full web receiver version rather than the HTML5, and use that. So again, we're using the data to proactively look at issues, find issues that we know are going to become a problem, and get resolved for the users without, in some cases, even having to talk to them. When it comes to enforcement of like sort of antivirus and things like that, you're really at the mercy of things when it comes to unmanaged devices. However, Citrix are doing a lot of work here with things like app protection, which are coming along to help protect against keyloggers and things like that. And Citrix are actually taking this really seriously. I am under NDA, so I can't say any more, but I know that they are actively developing other tools to help out in this environment. So yes, make sure you get on the latest Workspace app version. Again, make sure all the users are on the latest version you can get them on, because when these new features come along and get released, if they're not on the updated clients, they won't be able to take advantage of them. So again, the data is your friend. Finding these things out will help you out. We also found a few things that we had, like, for instance, users who'd never logged on through RDSH, had old RDSH sort of profile paths and things like that set up, drive mappings that were inaccessible. These things weren't issues day to day, but as soon as we switched them to this platform, they did become issues. So as soon as we found these issues, what we did, again, we went out and we monitored and we checked the users and we ran reports to find out users who might have these issues, so we could fix them ahead of time, and meant that it didn't take them like 10-15 minutes to log on because it was trying to access some old home folder that didn't exist anymore. So again, look for errors, find them, and use the data to help you. Use your monitoring to help you out, to help you head these things off before they become an issue. Now, once we've got all the users onboarded and we start talking about what's happening in their sessions, another very important thing is let's talk about video, right? Because before COVID, if your average Citrix user had come up to me and said, we're having a lot of issues with video conferencing or video calling, I would have said, well, turn it off, right? Because you don't need video, just use the audio, you're absolutely fine. And when you're in the office, that is probably a pretty fair thing to say. Screen sharing you need to use, but not really high quality video. However, now we've all been moved out there, video has taken on a huge amount of criticality, right? Because not just helping people collaborate, but this kind of interaction provided by even being able to see people's faces is crucial to stop people feeling isolated, right? So we need to have as a big priority now to provision quality, highly responsive video and audio, because even if you've got the video, but it's a bit disjointed, it doesn't give you that connection with another human person, right? So I think it's mega critical now that we provide performant video on these platforms. Many technologies used for video sharing, WebEx, BlueJeans, things like that. I'm going to talk about Teams, because I think Teams is probably one of the more prevalent ones out there, and a lot of people have adopted Teams as we've moved towards the whole coronavirus response. In order to maximize your team's performance, you can take steps like, firstly, ensuring it gets installed correctly. This really bit us really badly. We didn't install it. You see the path we've got there in the second line. You need the all user and the all users switches in there. If you don't have that, what you'll find is that the user-based version will try and update, conflict with the machine version, Teams will crash, it will disconnect, and everything will be awful. You need to get the user-based version uninstalled if you fall into that trap. The third line there has got a link, and obviously we're providing the slides out here, a link to a good example of a script that will help you get it uninstalled and get yourself back on an even keel. If you haven't got GPU in your virtual platforms, you can turn off GPU hardware acceleration in the desktop config file. Very, very important thing though for Teams performance is offloading. You need to get offloading available in there. It'll make a huge, huge difference. We have a hosted Citrix platform with no offloading, and the performance is massively better on our cloud platform, which has full offloading. If you've got the latest versions of the Citrix VDA and your clients have the Citrix Workspace app, so again, you need to keep checking on that. You can use offloading on clients beyond the ones that Microsoft say it will work on, right? Microsoft, you have to have a fairly new Windows 10 client version. version. If you're using the Citrix stuff, you can use Linux, you can use Windows 7, things like that. If you can't get the offloading working, then consider switching your users to the web client version of Teams, which is difficult but not undoable, and use Citrix browser content redirection to redirect the web client version back to the user's client. When it comes to managing Teams, FSLogix has got to be one of the things of choice, either the full profile containers version or the Office 365 containers version. It is really makes things a hell of a lot easier. If you are using FSLogix, the full profile containers version, configure an exclusion for the cached storage folder, and you'll save yourself tons of disk space and storage as well. But yeah, with Teams, offloading is king, right? So again, it's also when you're monitoring the environment, what you need to do is get out there and search for users that are hammering the CPU with Teams, because usually there will be users who aren't offloading, and then get onto them, find out why they're not, and you'll improve their experience right across the board. You can also, Teams is a bit funny because it never sort of closes when you click the X. You have to right click on the icon in the notification area and choose quit instead. So try and teach the users these little tricks. Check the devices area to see if their devices are being detected properly. Teach them to close it down if they change devices. Again, try and stay up to date with the Teams machine installer versions. This is where evergreen installs can really help you out. We fell behind a bit and we had users complaining that they were missing certain Teams features. And what we did was we helped them out by getting it updated for them. So again, try and stay on top of it, but also try and help them to help themselves. So I think another one of the huge changes we've found is that video is now mega important to everyone, right? So you cannot scrimp on video quality at all. Before, people used to just treat video almost as a kind of an afterthought, really, unless you're in certain specific verticals. But now, high quality, real-time video and audio performance is essential to a remote workforce, even to possibly their mental health, really, in some stages. Some people don't have the best work from home environments. They can be very stressful. So making that connection with people is very vital. Now, another important point to make is a lot of people kind of used to just use the odd Citrix app. They'd have a desktop, they'd have maybe an old app that was provisioned via Citrix, or then we might use Citrix when they went home and they wanted to do some work late at night or something like that. That's all gone out the window now. For a lot of us, this is now our primary user platform, right? So if you get any degradation in performance, even a little bit, you're impacting your business. And this is where, I call them out now, the technology like Goliath that gets right into the user session and finds out all that detail about what's actually happening on the user's desktop that they're seeing, right? This is where you need to identify things. Get out there and identify your hardest hitting applications, right? And tell you what they are now. They're Teams and Chrome, all joking aside, they probably are. There's a lot of things you can do with Chrome: turn off hardware acceleration, browser content redirection, ad blocking, a lot of ways you can do. Optimize everything as much as possible, right, in line with the vendor and the community guidelines, and baseline and test against every change that you make in your environment. You bring a new application on board, take a new baseline, do your test. This is where this whole rolling testing regime comes in really handy. You're constantly testing, constantly measuring, constantly feeding it back. Resource and bandwidth as well is vital, because everybody needs to use the video now as well, right? And don't forget, your users need this to perform. They're hosting virtual meetups, virtual social events. They're doing VBAs sessions, all sorts of things. People are conducting interviews. Kids are doing lessons over the Zoom calls and Teams calls, right? It is absolutely vital that we get every last bit of performance out of our platforms at this stage. Data access is another thing worth calling out. You've got to make sure your users have access to all of their data. We're in a segregated environment, so OneDrive was a big help for us. If you're on Server 2019 or higher versions of Windows 10, Files on Demand and Storage Sense can make a huge difference. You need to monitor to ensure that you're not, providing access to data and impacting the network. That's one thing we found, because we weren't on Server 2019. We had to use the OneDrive web client because the network uplift would have been too much. But again, that's where monitoring helps you. If you're using the full OneDrive sync client, and obviously FSLogix is your friend there as well. Now, when it comes down to talking about monitoring user activity, right, everybody gets a bit scared because they think, well, what are they doing? Are they spying on us to make sure we're doing enough work? I think that's a bit unfair, right? We're not looking to micromanage everyone. I think one thing is Firstly, to try and identify user patterns, right? So look at your users, look at how they're working. Now, people may have kids at home that they've got to look after, right? So it may be that they're changing their working patterns. Maybe they're working in the evenings and later on than they normally would be. So thing you can feed back from here is, do we need to change the hours of support, right, to adjust to our new kind of user base? The other thing is, make sure users don't work too long. I've spoken to a lot of people who feel like they feel under pressure to do more work because they're now working remotely and their manager can't see them, yeah? So I think it's fair for people to use monitoring to say, how long are people staying logged on and active for, right? And why are they doing that? And to actually get onto them and say, you don't need to work 12, 14 hours a day just to try and sort of prove that you're doing some work, right? Identify people who are taking risks with their health potentially by doing this and burning themselves out. Another interesting thing is as well, and we're going to talk about security next slide, is that if you identify sort of patterns of users working and all of a sudden you get a change to that pattern. So maybe you've got John who logs on always, he's never on any later than 7 o'clock, for instance. And then you see a log on from John and some activity at 3:30 in the morning or something like that. That's the sort of thing that could warrant a little bit of investigation. It may be that he just couldn't sleep, but it may be that his account's been compromised. So it does help you out. Identifying and plotting the trends helps you have a good effect. You tweak performance for the users so that the small changes can make a difference, and you also make sure that they aren't going above and beyond and risking things for themselves by working much too hard. Now, the unfortunate thing is, when we put together all this wonderful, beautiful, performant infrastructure, which is absolutely great, and then security come along, the CISO come along and say, right, we need all these agents installed and we need it all securing. The best way to avoid that is to do security by default, right? When you're setting all this up, think of it from a security perspective. Familiarize your users with the new ways of working, like MFA and biometrics and smart cards, right? Get out there straight away and block all that low-hanging fruit, things like registry editors and PowerShells if you can, and FTP access and access to local drives. Cut it all off so if you do get a breach, then it's harder for attackers to move laterally through the network. Again, let's talk about monitoring, detection, logging, auditing, and connecting all that data centrally is absolutely vital, not just to performance, but also to the breach response as well. Myself and another CTP, Dave Brett, did a really good presentation about balancing security and usability. In fact, I think next Friday, a week tomorrow, he is presenting that session, an updated version of it at Virtual Expo. So that might be one to go and sign up for. But again, if you've got these DevOps build processes, you are limiting the lifespan of these persistent threats. And if a threat is identified, you can terminate those instances straight away and have them back up and running in less than a minute or so. And be aware that the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that a lot of workers have shifted the way of working has been taken advantage of by attackers looking to spearfish people and exploit the confusion. So really, you need to be more on your guard than you actually were previously. So just a couple of things to think about. Will we ever go back to the traditional office model? A customer I work with saved £7 million in 3 months on travel costs for the UK alone, which is incredible. And even the cost of the solution we put in place, there's still a big net profit around that. I'm definitely not going back to the office. I hate commuting. A lot of people have enjoyed the change, although not all. Circumstances or personality or role may not. But interesting one to report is I spoke to a guy out in India who lives 20 miles away from the office he normally works at. And he told me he had saved 8 hours a day of traveling. 8 hours a day, that's 40 more hours of life living he's got away. I've felt genuinely fantastic that that guy had saved so much. Would you even want to go back to the office in that situation? I think the real new normal will probably be a hybrid model. Your workers will spend most of the time at home with fortnightly or monthly meetings, maybe with teams in the office. Some things should never be remote. Virtual conferences should never be remote. I think conferences should be back face-to-face because I love those. For salesmen and creative types, they may need to go to the office a lot more, but I'd like to see things like new work hubs spring up, regional hubs, and we can clear out all those huge office blocks in the middle of cities and give them to the homeless people to live, and we can all live out in the country and work just as effectively rather than living in the city. I'd love to say that be COVID-19's legacy. Another important part is that our DR has totally changed, right? We used to have standby offices full of desks and printers and things like that, and these have been totally mothballed. A lot of the people and the customers I work with said, that's worked for everyone. That's our DR solution now. So another big change that we're seeing is that DR is on the way out. DR sites anyway. So just quickly, some key takeaways here that I'm going to talk about. Don't fail to prepare. We don't need to get caught on the hop by this again. Scaling is key. That model we put together, I am immensely proud of. We can scale at such a rapid rate. We're actually looking at moving to Azure maybe instead of AWS, and we can actually take the code and just transport that straight into Azure, which is brilliant. I think it's totally modular. Put security in by default. Teach your users, your support guys, to look at things like client versions and network connectivity and operating system versions, kind of spin around the way that we've done that support. Video tutorials and self-help tools and things like that are all great. Providing video and audio is now a huge thing. I never thought it would be a thing, but now it has become massively important to everyone. And like I said, monitoring should drive everything that you do, right? We are totally reliant on monitoring now. We need to be able to see that data to understand impact, understand any degradation in the provision of the services that we are providing out there. And I think that is me. And I think I might be just about on the right amount of time for once. So, which is a turn up for the book. So is it Yemi I need to hand control across to you? So there you go.
Great. Well, thanks, James. We thought we'd wrap up here just with a few slides. And actually, Yemi, you know what? I was going to jump because one of the questions that came through was, how can Goliath help? Thanks for the call out, James. And instead of going through some slides, I thought, Yemi, why don't you jump into the demo and just give a 3 to 5 minute overview of some of the data that Goliath can bring to really help you understand and anticipate, troubleshoot, and document that entire user experience, including the backend infrastructure. And while Yemi goes through the demo, please keep your questions coming. We have a few others, so we want to definitely leave a few minutes there at the end, Yemi. So just a quick overview, and we can always send more information out should anyone be interested.
Absolutely, yeah. And where I'm going to start actually is going to be this view here, which is the automatic discovery and dependency map view. So we talk a lot about embedded intelligence and automation. This is sort of one portion of the technology that's really driven by that, because this will automatically discover all of those components that are available in your environment. It'll map them out. It'll then add over 250 monitoring rules to the environment. It's going to be monitoring for conditions, failure points, thresholds, and events that, if not taken care of, can actually cause end user experience issues. So these monitoring rules, these underlying embedded intelligent rules, are going to be driving the heat map structure that is present here. So as issues start to take place on different components, they start to turn red or orange depending on the severity. And then you can click on them, of course, look at resource utilization on the right-hand side of the screen, context-specific health checks based on the role of that component in your Citrix delivery infrastructure. And of course, being able to see any alerts that have triggered on that machine, and how those can actually impact the user experience. This is where you see things like why connection failures are taking place on what machines for what users. And you can sort of analyze this in a sort of high level view. But you can also drill down into a more logical view of the environment, where you can see all of your delivery groups, all of your machine catalogs, gold images, if those are available. And you can then even click down on a particular delivery group, where you can then see details on each portion of that delivery group, tying it back down to the components that are driving performance. So here's where you would see, of course, for the delivery group, resource utilization, average end user experience metrics like ICA latency, average round trip time, average network latency, and very importantly, average connection speed that the users have at their locations to access the environment. This tells you whether or not a particular site, maybe a delivery group, has enough connectivity at their locations, as James mentioned, to access the environment. Maybe a particular office location has gone down. Maybe users in a particular geographic group have an ISP that have had an issue. This will automatically give you that macro view, and then you can tie it all back down to the machine catalog, even the hypervisor cluster, and even individual hypervisor hosts that are supporting the environment. So this is going to give you a quick sort of knock view of your environment, as well as a troubleshooting stop to understand what is actually driving or bottlenecking performance at a sort of 40,000 foot or a macro view. Now with that, where do you go when an individual user has a problem? User calls in saying, my session is slow, I can't leverage Teams correctly, so on and so forth. That's when you can flip over to this portion here, which is the Citrix virtual apps and desktop session display. This is where all of those sessions in the environment will populate. Keep in mind that we not only are going to show you current or active sessions, we're going to show you historic sessions as well. We actually don't average or roll up any information we collect within the technology. So you get the same amount of granularity in a session from today as you would from a session from 2 weeks ago, a month ago, 2 months ago, so on and so forth, depending on how long you would like to keep the data for. Now, of course, there's a number of different ways that you could, pull in sessions and customize this page. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to click on a session here. And what you get is details into everything that affected this particular user session with data aligned to the time frame of this session. So I can tell when this user started having round trip time issues. Was that due to poor network latency, as you can sort of see here in this particular session? And was that due to, and I can see their connection speed at the time that they were having those issues. So now I can correlate drops in connection speed with spikes in network latency, as well as also spikes in round trip time, telling this user, hey, I can see that about 3 p.m. you had an issue with connectivity, and that's because your connection went from about 30 megabits per second to about 2. What happened at 3 p.m. at your home location? That's when they could say, hey, my kids got home from work, they got on Xbox or something like that, or maybe I moved to a different room, right? And my router's in my basement. So those sort of data-driven conversations can really be enabled by having the details that is really sort of that can give you the ability to pinpoint exactly where the slowness is coming from. Of course, we have the VM resources here as well as the host resources, as well as details into the IC8 channels for the individual user session. So particularly as users are now starting to leverage Teams and GoToMeeting and WebEx, as James mentioned in his presentation, having the ability to split out all of the different channels that are available, right, inside of a user session, things like clipboard bandwidth, scanner bandwidth, thin-wire bandwidth, which is the Citrix display adapter. This can allow IT not only to pinpoint exactly what actions the user took inside of the session that might have caused latency, but this is another tool that can be used to plan out and to configure the environment to be able to support whatever needs that users have while they're leveraging and working from home, leveraging the infrastructure. And of course, we have the resources for the VMs, for the hypervisor hosts as well, the applications and processes running in that session down to alerts and event logs. So basically, by the time you've traversed through the tabs here, you can emerge with the conclusion as to what's causing an issue in a session. Keep in mind, we keep all of this data historically as well, giving you the ability to share the data, to export the data, as well as enhance it, leveraging reporting and even third-party tools, let's say like Power BI or Tableau. So you can really understand exactly what's impacting your users and then focus on sort of remediating those and putting in permanent fix actions in order to deliver a better experience to your users.
Great. Thank you, Yemi, for that quick overview. I hope that was helpful for the individual asked the question. I'm just going to jump into a few questions here because we're running at the top of the hour. Doug asked, is this still cost effective on a smaller scale? And they have a number of users working remotely, but that might change based on their environment and go back to the office. So the quick answer, Doug, in terms of Goliath, if that's what you're asking, absolutely. When you looked at our logos that I showed at the beginning, if you were on there to start, we have organizations that have some of the largest Citrix infrastructures, but we also work with organizations that have much smaller user bases, and they can use our tool because we have a price profile as well as an ease of use profile, which you saw, that can align. And it's not just for remote workers. I mean, we focused a lot on that. But when employees go back to the office, and in fact, a lot of our clients are in healthcare, and the doctors are still sitting there in the hospital, there's a lot of pieces and components that can impact the user experience. I think, James, your first slide showed all of those elements that need to work together almost in tandem, both on premises and in cloud, in order to deliver a user experience. So being able to have all those points in a single screen to isolate root cause, it doesn't matter if your end users are on-prem or in the office, or if your users are working remotely. I think where you look for the data and where you might start your troubleshooting workflow changes based on location.
I was
James,
actually going to say as well, yeah, if we're talking about the rapid provisioning working in the same way, as I said, we designed that framework and it originally was just 300 users, which again is probably quite a bit compared to some people, but it's a portable framework, yeah, and if you've got guys who know what they're doing with things like that, it's easy enough to build it up and port it out. Having said that, if somebody had asked me to do it, I would have struggled to do it. So yeah, if you've got guys with the skill set, but cloud stuff is taking off now. So yes, I think that is very much something that works for any number of users. Yeah.
James, Jane is very nervous for you and Kevin to survive the curfew that you mentioned early on there. So you have someone concerned for you.
Yes. That sounds like Jane. I'm sure she knows the answer. We will definitely survive.
Another question came from Sarah. Can you do a lot of what you were talking about in terms of monitoring with Citrix Director? I might actually turn that one over to you, James, to take your first external opinion. Yeah. I've got my own.
Citrix Director, I mean, it used to be Edge Site, right? And I used to call Edge Site a Marmite technology because you either loved it or you hated it. And I never loved it, let's put it that way. I find it difficult sometimes to navigate my way around Direct. I mean, there's a lot of data there, right? But it's hard to unearth it in a way that makes sense. And the one that I would suggest other tools, what I like about other tools is you get an overview that presents everything you need to know about a session. Whereas with Director, I've got to go digging, and I have one guy who's quite good with Director, and he always sends me spreadsheets out. And I think, I don't want to see spreadsheets, right? I want to see reds and yellows. I want to see icons and graphs and things like that. So yeah, you can get quite a bit of data from Director, not as much as you really need in general, but it's finding the data that's the problem, and it can be a bit of a pain.
And Yemi, I think I actually hit a slide in there, if you don't mind bringing up around Director. I think, James, you hit on it, right? And I'm just going to repeat what we hear from our clients. Director can monitor many of those Citrix elements pretty well. But again, there's a lot of elements that are outside of the core to Citrix, from the end users and the application, so testing application availability, especially in healthcare with those EHR modules I mentioned earlier. That hypervisor host layer, it might be a VMware, a Nutanix. It doesn't mean that you're solidified just on the Citrix stack. All the back-end systems like Active Directory, licensing server. I'm sure many of you on the call today have had those pesky GPO issues where you troubleshoot for hours and hours only to find that it's a printer or driver mapping that was causing issues in the profile load. All the end user endpoint devices and the network, the storage, the printer, all of that equates to the user experience, plus the user behavior themselves, right? So when people are working from home, that's something we found with our clients. They might run audio more in the background. They're listening to Spotify, they're running the latest Netflix series or whatever series they're watching, not realizing that's impacting performance. And so I think that's where the purpose-built tools like Goliath, we found the need is to see that end-to-end, as Yemi talked about, and this just highlights it there. Let's take one more question. I know we're a little bit over, so appreciate some that have stayed on. Another question that came up was, Goliath, do you have specific reports that show Citrix activity? So I know, James, you mentioned it. Yemi, do you have one of those reports? We actually do. So we have something, perfect. We have the end user productivity report. And James, I would like to second what our clients use this for is not that big brother method. I think that's what many are fearful of. It really is just to get insights on how employees are working. When are they starting their day? Are they working traditional hours? Are they extending earlier in the morning, in the evening? In fact, one of our customers told us after seeing this report, they found that their employees were working 10, 12-hour days, and that was not the expectation. So this report does identify per user session when they logged on, when they logged off, and how active they were in that session. So moving their mouse, clicking on the keyboard, doing other activities, and it will actually give you a percentage of time. It's hidden here on this call out, but it will also show you max inactivity. So you can see when someone maybe has stepped away for multiple hours. And we've used this with customers where they've aligned this data to Active Directory, so they can actually define at a department level who's being more successful at home. So as they start to re-enter into the office, they're trying to identify which departments are doing really well working from home. And I think, James, you called it out: sales, creative, design. Often those organizations, they like to be more social. They want that interaction. They thrive off of it. And so organizations are seeing, can we see patterns and trends so that as we start to go back to the office, we identify those that maybe need to get in first as we start to re-entry others.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of movement in that kind of space coming up, where people, with more of a remote workforce, how do we look at trends as to what they're doing and what they're not doing? And again, like I said, are they doing anything out of the ordinary that maybe, raises the sort of specter that something funny may be going on, or even somebody is logging on in the middle of the night, maybe they've got a health issue in it, so not necessarily they've been hacked. So there is a lot of benefit amongst data. I mean, it's all about data. Yeah, data is the new oil.
It is. It very much so is. Well, we're at the top of the hour. Again, James, I can't thank you enough. Anyone that's listening, if you are interested in more information from Goliath, or I'm sure you can find James on his social channels, but you can also email in techinfo@goliathtechnologies.com. We're happy to respond to any additional questions, or even offer you a free trial of any of the software and reports that you saw today. But again, James, I look forward to doing another one of these. It was the first time you and I got to collaborate together, so I very much appreciate it. And I thank all of you that attended today. I hope everyone has a great day and the rest of their week. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Guys.